welcome Philip Bond, who's the president for Potomac International and Associates,
Yes.
and partners, right? Sorry, I
Yes,
apologize.
partners. That's all right.
And Phil, it's a great pleasure to have you. You have such a vast, and extensive background in the government space around technology acquisitions, and I wanted to just kind of dive into some of that conversation around supply chain, but it's just in general about how government procures. And then, but before we dive into that, maybe give us a quick background in terms of how do you get to
Sure.
work with the government, because you had some very senior positions, and a lot of people are typically wonder how one how a person gets into such high level seniority in the government.
Yeah, sure. Well, I came back to Washington, D.C. from Washington State more than 30 years ago, just with a passion for public policy, especially around national security. And through political connections in Washington State, was able to get appointed to a job at the Defense Department in legislative affairs, which was perfect because it combined my interest of national security and the politics of policy development on Capitol Hill. From there, I jumped up to the Hill to be a chief of staff to a member, and then back to the Pentagon for then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney as his number 2 legislative advisor.
But hold on, Phil. Like, how did you even get like the first position? How do
Very
people?
good position, sure.
Just kind of like because it's a lot of times it's an enigma, right? A lot of people, and you specifically chose that, right? So you had a passion for that. So,
Yeah.
Do you just go out to, and apply, or what's that process like? And I'm assuming it's not easy to get to even the first position.
Well, yeah, my experience is all on the appointee side, meaning you're appointed with political connections rather than a career civil servant who would make a full career out of government. So I had been active in politics in Washington State. I'd actually run for office for the state legislature. And along the way, had come to know the state party chair quite well, a woman named Jennifer Dunn, who was a real favorite in the Reagan White House because she had been with him when he challenged sitting President Gerald Ford in a primary. So she was a real favorite, and she intervened on my behalf at the White House to get me more or less blessed by the Reagan administration to work in that administration. And then it fell to me to kind of find an opening that seemed to fit my qualifications. And after I identified that, the White House made sure I was interviewed, and boom, I got that first job in legislative affairs for then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. That was a very long time ago. You kids who are watching are going to have to look that up.
Phil, but the government is such a large organization, and it takes a long time, right, to figure out the kind of the inner works of the various departments and the whole structure, right?
There's also, for potential political appointees, there's actually a publication that comes out with each new administration of all of the appointee-related jobs. So most jobs, of course, are saved for career civil servants, and then there are positions that are appointed by each incoming administration. So you look through that book, you find a good match for yourself, and throw your hat in the ring. If you're blessed by the White House, they call over that agency and say, hey, make sure you at least interview this guy or this gal. And so, that gets your toe in the door. And then like any other job, you have to interview well and bring some valid credentials to the table.
So if the administration changes, right, if there's change of governments, what happened to all these appointees? Like, how did they have to move on?
They're out.
Wow.
So with very few exceptions. A few people, it's somewhat controversial, but a few people who are political appointees then apply for a career job in the agency where they're working. It's called burrowing in, and they burrow in before the change occurs and get into a career slot where they'll be safe. So as I said, somewhat controversial for you to come in the political door and then apply for a career job. But the vast majority, 9 out of 10 or more, simply are shown the door. Like, hey,
wow.
dude. And even like when Reagan was followed by George H.W. Bush, his own vice president, when his people were running then the personnel appointments, they still said to the Reagan people, hey, it's time to move on.
It's nuts because, like, these people obviously have the skill set. So,
Yeah.
because you mentioned it's not just throwing your hat into the, your card.
Yeah, you have to have some real credentials to go with
Yeah,
it.
you have to have real credentials, and then it's like a regular job interview. You got to prove yourself. You get the job, and then so just getting rid of all the whole structure to get
Yes.
new people in. That's almost sounds like
Well,
wasteful.
it's a little bit crazy. It isn't when you think of a complete party change, because the political appointments are a fraction of the overall federal government. So the career people, like at Commerce where I worked, there are half a dozen bureaus. Every bureau has an appointed undersecretary to run it, but the deputy undersecretary is a career person to give that continuity and
Okay.
history and everything else. So there's always a career senior person there who can kind of keep everything moving and understand. But understandably also is that a new president wants his people running the show so that he doesn't have people pushing back on his own administration from within his administration. So, you make a good point, because even when Bush took over from Reagan, the White House said, well, clear out the political appointees because we have our own political appointees we want to put in. And Dick Cheney's team kind of pushed back on that and said, no, we may want to keep some of them. And so in my case, the assistant secretary, who had been Dick Cheney's chief of staff on the Hill and was very close to him, he did a kind of a democratic thing. He called in all the military officers and career staff in that particular office and said, write down on a piece of paper which, if any, of the politicals you think I should keep. Wow. And because he wanted their opinion. And so he looked at that, and I was on more sheets of paper than anybody else. Nobody knew that was going to happen. It was a completely blind thing. But he said, okay, I'm keeping this one guy, and the rest of them will have to go. So
that's incredible. So what do you think that is? Do you think you just were a likable guy, or you had a chance to talk to a lot of people?
Incredible sense of humor and personal charm.
And modesty.
I think, yeah, honesty and real modesty, right? No, I think I like anything. It's comes down to your personal relationships, the kind of level of trust that you have with those folks, and kind of mutual respect, and so not that the other people weren't real experts, but I just think that there was a little bit more camaraderie and day-to-day comparing notes, maybe in my case, than some of the others. Some of the others were, saw the train coming and had already left. So it wasn't like it was me against 100 other people. There's just a few of us left at that point.
So you had an advantage because you had a chance to kind of preserve that continuity, right?
Right.
Kept that role.
Because of having that continuity, the assistant secretary moved me up to be his kind of executive assistant, so that I could say, wait a minute, here's the history on this.
Yeah, that's amazing.
With that, yeah. And then from there, I jumped up to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, so tell me a bit about kind of, what's the day-to-day like? What kind of project were you, whatever you can divulge, of course, were you involved in? And, the sheer size of some of these projects, I'm sure it's somebody that coming from the kind of the civilian or the private sector, the scale of some of these projects is tremendous compared to a private sector, for example. Right. And so this is something you need to learn. It's kind of on the job training. How do you deal with some of these vast numbers, some of these like a lot of moving parts, which you don't typically get? There's a lot of like kind of challenges when you deal with, with the government organizations, the processes and so on. So whatever you can provide like a little bit of a glimpse and insight into that, that'd be great. Sure.
In the very first appointment I had at the Pentagon, I was kind of the point man for the military construction budget on behalf of the secretary.
Wow.
So that's, tens of billions of dollars every year to modernize or maintain the bases, or in some cases close or open new ones, depending on geopolitics and other things. So, that meant for me, a civilian coming in and trying to study up really fast to understand not only what projects did the department want to fund to maintain or upgrade, but how did that survive the political filter on Capitol Hill, where the other party was in the majority and had other priorities of theirs. And of course, those aren't all equal. The chairman of the committee is going to get first pick, and then the more senior members after that. So you had to kind of play this multi-level chess game to understand not just what the administration wanted, but what was going to fly on Capitol Hill, and then monitor that because the House view might be different than the Senate view, and then they get together for the final bill in conference, and things may change again. So a lot of big numbers and a lot of numbers with military bases all around the world, and then watching the politics of that play out, try to stay on top of it, so you could brief the secretary that if his number one priority, a modernization of a strategic base, was not going to be funded, he wanted to know about that right away so he could start calling the chairman on the Hill and underscoring to them how badly he needed that. So that was fun. At the same time, I sometimes got some really what I call Forrest Gump moments. I was the guy.
I love that movie, by the way. But
Yes, don't we all? But it was like that because you can look in different pictures and, hey, I know that guy in the background. So when Dick Cheney came in as Secretary of Defense and Colin Powell, the late Colin Powell, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, one of my jobs was running what we call a murder board, which is convene all of the top officials in the Pentagon in the different policy areas. And our staff would have run to Capitol Hill to find out what questions the Armed Services Committee wanted to ask when the secretary and the chairman appeared for their annual budget briefing to Congress. So we had all these questions. We review them all and what the right and politic answer was for each of those. And then we would show up with, each of the branches of the armed service, senior officers and political appointees there, all lined up in this long, long row behind the secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Well, Dick Cheney had sat through the entire, no other secretary has done this. I think maybe Teddy Roosevelt, going way back to Secretary of the Navy days, but he sat through every line item budget decision for the.
Wow. How long does that take?
It's a months long project.
Wow.
And he sat through them all. He was blessed with a photographic memory. So he knew the budget like no secretary has ever known the budget. And at any rate, we were getting ready in the murder board, and Cheney stops and he says, "Wait a minute, how many of you guys go with us to the hearing?" And about 30 hands go up, and he said, no, we're not having that. One more question. Who flips the charts for General Powell and I? Well, that was me, so my hand went up. He said, "Okay, Mr. Chart Flipper, Colin, and I, nobody else."
No way.
So that day, the hearing starts. The chairman of Armed Services says, "Mr. Secretary, welcome back." He had been a House member and appointed to secretary. So he welcomes him back to the House, and we're ready to start as soon as your staff gets here. And Cheney makes a big show, turning around like, "Yeah, we're all here, Mr. Chairman." So that was a Forrest Gump moment. Me, Cheney, and Powell, the only guys in the room.
That's incredible. That's an unbelievable story. That's
and then Cheney later
so
appointed me when the Soviet Union started to crumble, and toward the very end, they had sent a senior delegation of their military officials, a bunch of generals, to tour U.S. bases. And of course, that was a diplomatic decision to do that. The defense officials were scared to death of showing them anything relevant. The House Armed Services Committee Chairman Les Aspin, wanted to have more of an open kimono, if you will. And so I was the guy stuck trying to negotiate between chairman wanting to show him everything and the secretary not wanting to show them anything. So that was a fascinating,
I was about to ask you. You beat me to it, Phil. I was about to ask you if you were ever between a rock and a hard place.
That was one for sure.
Because this is what happens when you get to a senior level. You have to please different forces, especially in the government.
Later, just a quick anecdote. I also was in charge of deciding, more appropriately, informing senior members of the Senate who had requested an airplane for their congressional delegation. You hear about congressional trips to different hot spots around the world, and they fly on military aircraft. And so I was the guy who had to let them know if they were going to get a plane or not going to get a plane. And you can imagine how unhappy a very senior member might be when they get a call from somebody they've never heard of saying, you're not going to get an airplane.
So that's so you're the messenger,
Yeah.
and
And
they say don't shoot the messenger, but in this particular case,
I
you
was
were the
shocked.
firing squad.
I was shocked. I had one member, I won't say who, reach under his desk and pull out a ceremonial tomahawk that was like about 4 feet long. And he was waving it at me. So you tell Cheney blankety blankety blank.
That's incredible.
Fun moments in government, right?
Yeah, but it's funny because when somebody from outside looking in, right?
Yeah,
Um, and you see some of the the events on TV or whatever, it sounds so boring.
yeah,
Majority is like boring, and there's no discussion. Every once in a while, there's something going on, but it's not necessarily like that. There's a lot of like action, quote unquote,
yes,
within the
right,
department, and I'm sure there's also politics. It's not there's a
right.
reputation for politics, right, to be a certain way.
Yes,
So and
there's a
again,
ton of drama
you know,
in politics, which I am sometimes frustrated that movies or TV shows really fail to capture that effectively, which I'm sure is hard to do because it's like a multi-level chess game. Like I said before, you know, two people may be confronting one another, but there's two or three subplots behind each of those. So it's not just that they're arguing over a line item in the budget, but the reason this guy's arguing is because his district just got changed and that base is now going to be in his district and he's trying to bring home a success to help his reelection. And that doesn't get stated because it seems like just a numbers argument, but really it's about politics in the next election. So you have to understand the politics to really unwind the policy.
yeah. And then you have to pick your allies, quote unquote, within the administration to because I'm assuming again people always think about kind of the next role and how to position themselves to be there when the time comes and there's the next big role. So was this always in the back of your mind, or is it not completely out of the question in terms of how you made decisions in terms of what to do, what action to take?
Well,
It's a difficult question, I know.
with that first job, it wasn't so much. I was just, got thrown into the deep end of the pool, and I was trying to learn as fast as I could to be effective and so forth. And then I got an opportunity to go up to Capitol Hill to be chief of staff to a relatively senior member, and so I wasn't looking too far down the line on anything in that first job at the Pentagon. But later on, when I came back in the George W. Bush administration, I was Undersecretary of Commerce and then Chief of Staff contemporaneously to the Secretary. And there, farther along in your career, you're definitely thinking about, what can I do next? It doesn't affect your decisions on policy, but it may affect your decisions on how you spend your time and what your priorities are. So I sat down actually with my senior politicals and said, tell me what you want to do next. Because I don't want to run into a situation where you're dragging your feet because it's not something you want to do, or you're upset that I've asked somebody else to do something and it's really where you see your career. Let's just put our cards on the table. And that helped us just avoid those kind of circumstances and to allow people as much as possible to pursue their interests, but not let it affect their decision on how best to advance the administration's agenda. It's just letting them run a little bit in lanes that they were more interested in.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And also the interesting piece is that when you're working with such large budgets, right? Sometimes it's hard to fathom, even like in terms of like what
Yes.
size of we're talking about. Like some countries don't have that kind of budget.
Right.
The
Right.
GDP is like not that size. There's a lot of zeros involved, right?
Yes.
There's also a lot of accountability, right? So, in a sense, that decision that you make have a tremendous impact beyond because it's like the budget, trickles down into the economy, into like different sectors and so on. So if you close the tap in one area,
Right.
the domino effect in terms of what can how was that treated? Do people realize that the decision they make have such a sometimes a paramount impact on, or is
Yeah.
it just not when you play that chess? because it's a chess, but it's a chess that has like a tremendous impact. So
Right,
if you
right.
lose a soldier somewhere, like, you never know what's the impact is going
Yeah,
to be.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
I would say I probably have two different perspectives on that. The first one is as a senior appointee myself, every decision I had to think about, is this supportive of the administration? Because you don't want to get caught being unsupportive of the people who appointed you. Secondly,
That's
even if
rule number one, right, Phil? It's
yes,
like,
that's a pretty good rule to live by.
yeah.
Secondly, if it is in support of the administration, does it also comply with OMB, the Management and Budget Office, with their definition of what supports? So I may say, hey, this program, the president likes this program, and so I'm going to express support for it. And OMB would say, well, yes, the president likes that program, but he only likes it to when it's funded up to this level. If it goes above that, he doesn't support it. So then you got to make sure you're keeping OMB happy. At the same time, you got to make sure that the chairman and ranking, both sides of the aisle are not going to be shooting at you so you're always trying to thread a needle on those decisions to make sure you're meeting all those prerequisites, before you get out publicly on stuff. I got lambasted in one hearing on something before the hearing. The members held a press conference to blast me. I hadn't even testified yet,
Wow.
but they knew, they just wanted to hit the administration, and they did the press conference and everything before I even had a chance to speak. And I did tell them in the hearing that, well, we advocated for it, but unfortunately that was not the final decision of the administration. At any rate, so that's the perspective of the appointee. You got a lot of things, and you got to try to thread that needle. On the member side, unfortunately, I don't think it's as sophisticated a view. I don't think they think through the repercussions as much. There are some members who do, and they're outstanding, but a lot of the members don't go any farther than how it polls back home, or how they feel about it with kind of a gut reaction, like, oh yeah, this would be a good thing to do. I'll give you a perfect example. Years and years ago, Senator Humphrey led the charge, who ran for president, Hubert Humphrey, led the charge for a full employment bill and just said, yeah, it should be the law of the United States that our goal is always to have unemployment under 3%. Well, yeah, who doesn't want high employment? But when you start making that the law, that then the government has to hire the people who aren't working just so you can meet the goal, then you're crowding out in private sector investment for real jobs, not make-believe jobs, and all kinds of unintended consequences. And I don't think members think about it the way maybe a systems engineer would think about it. If I change this, it's going to ripple through and change that. They just look at, hey, this polls at 80%, I'm going to do it. And whatever it is may or may not be good for the entire body politic or for the economy. So, I wish there was more thinking like that. That's why we have think tanks in town who try to point out the repercussions of different policy options. But with most members today in the United States, I think it's fair to say they don't think that deeply about it. And that's because most of the districts are not competitive. So your only race is your primary election against
Oh, wow.
the
Yeah.
activists in your party. Something like 85% of the House seats are not competitive. They're skewed heavily to one party or the other. And so that means you're always playing to your base, not necessarily thinking about what's the best thing overall. You're thinking about what's going to keep my base happy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's led, it's been one of the contributors to this kind of unhealthy hyper-partisanship that we have today, is that the districts are, for the most part, all about the primary race. So if I'm a Democrat, I run as far left as I can. If I'm a Republican, I run as far right as I can. And then they come to town and they've already staked out positions far right and far left. Kind of hard to meet in the middle when that's your starting point.
And it's like so so interesting because from a cybersecurity perspective,
Yes.
again, there's such a large organization with so many moving parts. As you mentioned, even decision where to put the budget on particular project requires, and we see that all the time. Capitol Hill, some of these folks are not savvy from a technology perspective at all,
Right.
and and now you're dealing with even more moving parts, and then cyber risk is not waiting for anyone.
Right.
The speed at which, this is not a 5-year project, the infrastructure. This is
Yes.
something that needs to be taken care of within the next 3 to 6 months.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a really good point, David, because members come back to town with the best of intentions. I really believe that they want to make the country better, but they come with a frame of reference and a set of experiences, and it's changing, but by and large, those are not technologists that are coming to Congress. And so they want to do something. They heard about a program or a piece of hardware that helped in some situation. And their first instinct is to say, okay, let's make that a requirement for everybody. Well, of course, it's technology. So what seems like a winner today may be outmoded in 6 months, or may already be outmoded by the time they heard of it. And so one of the things we always were telling members is don't mandate a specific technology. Tell us what solution you want, like you want incursions into the network to reduce by 50%. Don't tell us you must deploy this piece of software in all agencies, because that piece of software is going to be outmoded or surpassed by a better approach, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, that's a real issue. And then, our constitutional division of power is sometimes the issue, because the Hill will say, Congress will say, well, we don't want to give up power. But some of these circumstances, the executive needs to be able to move very quickly and not wait for Congress to buy off on it, or Congress to pass additional funding or whatever. And so increasingly in the cybersecurity realm, I think we'll see national security exemptions written into many of the laws, so that Congress, although they don't like to do this, will have to admit that in a crunch, if you claim that the national security is at risk, you're then free to go do what you need to do.
We just have to make sure that doesn't get abused.
Yes, right. Right.
So everything is in a matter of national security. Let's just go against this.
Right. And a critic would say, yeah, and in that crunch moment, the best lobbyist wins, not the best technology. And,
right.
it's part of the system. People trust the people they know. So, that gets factored in too. So it doesn't guarantee that just because you give the executive the freedom to do what they think needs to be done, that they'll pick the right solution. But it's better than waiting 6 months for Congress to pass a supplemental appropriation so you can go do what you need to do.
Yeah, and Phil, this is a matter of national security. I mean, we're talking about people are saying that we're in Cold War, a new cold cybersecurity war, basically. Yeah. With some of the nation states out there talking about SCADA systems that are compromised. And so, there's a lot of, and the government doesn't have a great track record of protecting some of these assets, like the OPM breach, some of the recent leaks of what was it, a bomber that was this entire,
that's right.
Was siphoned to nation state for a long time. What is the government currently doing to, and you know what, the government is a big organization, but there's a lot of smart people, right? It's not like this they chose to serve as civil servants or whatever and be part of it with a lofty mission to protect all of us, right? So what is the government currently doing? All those smart people getting together and figuring out, okay, we can't have this anymore. If it's a matter of national security, how do we protect ourselves as a nation and become better at protecting our assets and our infrastructure?
Right. So I think a good deal of credit has to go to the Biden administration on this, for having the president come out very early with an executive order to require the upgrading of security practices, more movement to the cloud, more multi-factor authentication, some things that to a technologist would be just basic good hygiene, but weren't done across this vast organization of the U.S. government. So they have put together an ambitious list of things that need to happen. And then one of those two is to centralize a little bit more power and authority in the Department of Homeland Security, especially over the civilian agencies, kind of exempting the national security and intelligence communities that I think are a little bit farther along in their security practices. So that too was good. Now it's going to become a question of execution, because government is huge and it does not move fast. And so that will become the next metric really to watch. They identified a lot of the right goals. They empowered a lot of the right people. Can they execute in a pretty reasonable fashion? Because as you said when you started this portion of the discussion, this stuff is happening all the time, and it doesn't go at government speed. It goes at private sector and criminal speed.
Yeah, which and whatever it is, there's high stakes here, just both
Yes.
from a budgetary perspective as well as the targets are huge, right?
Yes.
If you take down, a SCADA system that provides water for half a state, there's some pretty serious
Yeah,
consequences.
it's our economic security very fundamentally, but also our economic security when you think of all the intellectual property stored by the federal government, whether that's at DoD and plans for fighters and other advanced weapons, or at the Patent and Trademark Office, which holds most of the U.S. intellectual property, or at least pieces of it. Those are high risk things. So our economic security is absolutely intertwined with our national security.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I'm not going to name names, but I remember seeing a YouTube video of a broadcaster that went over to some country and then basically saw another an identical Apple store.
Oh, right, right.
1-to-1, including all the different products
Yeah,
associated
it's
with.
pretty hard to tell the difference.
Yeah, even the design, everything, including what they were wearing, and
Yeah.
so every single item. But that happened before. We've seen companies out there, without naming the state, the country, where they duplicated routers, the Cisco routers,
Yes, you bet.
and so on. And now we're talking about
Including,
specific.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but including, I think, in the infamous case you're referring to, they had copied the routers right down to the mistakes in the code. So you can go and say, hey, that's a mistake. That shouldn't be in there, but it was in the original and it's in yours too. How did that happen?
and
Yeah.
and and on top of that, this whole supply chain is critical because the components associated with a lot of the our critical technology infrastructure is coming from overseas, but now there's movement to bring some of this stuff in house. And there are 300,000 plus government suppliers, and the government is now mandating CMMC framework to a regulatory compliance environment to make sure that they comply. And I think they have until 2025
Yeah.
to
Yeah. And the take up has had some real challenges on that. But it's like the whole country woke up, in part because of the pandemic, to realize that we had galloped along for a good while as globalization played out, not really thinking about the implications of far-flung supply chains. It's great when your product at Walmart comes in at a very low price. A lot of Americans need that, but it's also problematic when it gets exposed and something happens to that supply chain. So a lot of rethinking going on about how much of those supply chains do we need to have at home, or at least some percentage of them at home, so that in a pinch they don't go sideways. And then the geopolitics of reliance on China is on everybody's mind. And then last and certainly not least, you factor in the attack vector that supply chains represent, and that bad guys can swim upstream from some HVAC vendor, as famously happened, into a target and do some real damage. So supply chains generally and supply chain security are now on the forefront of every policymaker's mind.
I remember seeing during the pandemic where we had some some supplies that were like mask factory somewhere overseas, and the local government basically went over and seized the entire supply, like the entire stock of masks. And it was an American factory, just happened to be overseas, and basically the government came in. It was the European government came in, nationalized it basically, and said, "Okay, it's our sovereign soil here, and we're sorry, we need it. We need it first."
Yeah.
And I think there's another country where they decided that to keep all the antibiotics
Right.
in-house.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And then others who just said, yeah, we have some stocks, but we're not selling them at this price, and then jacked up the price because of the problem. So, yeah, it just was a big eye opener, I think, for a lot of Americans that the sourcing of this stuff needs to be thought through a little bit. Not that government is always smart enough to pick the winners and losers, but for the really strategic, the things that connect to our national security, our economic security, we do have to think through those things and make sure that we can't be stranded because some country somewhere is upset about something that was done by the United States somewhere. So we do have to think through these and kind of rebalance, I think.
yeah,
And
and
what everybody agrees on is however we rebalance, make sure they're secure.
right. And even now with the even the example of the chip that are
Yeah.
being manufactured overseas, and there's a lack of them now, and I'm thinking, okay, well, all the Humvees or whatever, they had to be there's GM needs to manufacture and so on, like where if they don't have those, then we don't have we don't have vehicles. So it's
Right.
a how do we move some of the manufacturing here? So from a CMMC perspective, if you look
Yeah.
at the coming back to that topic, if you look at that framework in a quick glance, it looks pretty draconian. It's almost like you either have to do all those controls, which is, if you're making widgets and you're like a company of 50 employees making a component within a component within a
Right.
component, it's so tough to comply. But then yet it's like pass fail.
Mm-hmm.
Some in your opinion, how is that going to eventually resolve itself? Over
Well,
time.
I think the original scheme is pretty close to right in terms of as you go farther down the supply chain, you might be required levels 1 or 2 versus higher up the chain, and that the mega contractors here around the Beltway, not all of them are mega, but the really big ones that are here, they were all pretty much high up that CMMC chain already and should be required to be at the highest levels. I think what will inevitably happen is that is going to push out well beyond the defense industrial base to the .com world because everybody's got digital assets to lose, and so I think it's going to begin to migrate outside of well beyond the Beltway, well beyond the defense industrial base to really much more of a common certification people are going to be looking for in anybody they engage with online. So we'll see. It's bumps and starts here to begin, but the big players are fully bought in. They're pushing it down their supply chains, and I don't think there's going to be any going back. So even if we have more bumps in the road, it's still the only way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of doing business, and I also feel that eventually a CMMC-like type of regulatory environment will trickle into the private sector as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So
Absolutely. I think that's where it's inevitably headed. And as you say, that it may take on a different name, it may be sponsored by a different organization or organizations, but it is essentially going to be an equivalent to CMMC level, whatever, that has to go through the system. If we can't trust who our networks are touching, then people are going to be hesitant because there's just too many bad players out there.
now, how is the government going to basically review these certifications and then make sure everyone is compliant? Again, it's you need to create another body almost to review, because again, it's not just it's a very dynamic, right? Like if you're a company and then you acquire another company, all of a sudden you become from compliant to non-compliant depending on who you acquired.
Right.
So this is something that needs to be continuously reviewed, and there's going to be a body that needs to either certify or continuously review these, just like you do any other. You take your car every 2 years to get inspected.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, is there currently a structure in the government that is looking to take on that
Well,
role?
yeah, the CMMC office and its outside affiliate are kind of the tip of that spear right now. I think you're going to see and you're already seeing auditors and others who can come in and certify whether you meet levels, whatever. So I think that's just there are going to be a lot of different responses to that, creative responses, a lot of different players. And then Congress will be providing oversight all along the way as well. For the civilian agencies, DHS will provide some of the oversight, making sure that as we move, to that side of the house, ultimately that supply chains there are getting reviewed. So I think there will be a lot of people wanting to participate in oversight. In fact, I would probably make a bold prediction that we'll have a discussion in the not too distant future about having too many people looking over, and how do we standardize the people who are certifying and assessing. But I think there's so much money on the table, so much risk involved, that there are going to be a lot of creative responses to that. DoD and the intelligence communities, I think, are going to do this mostly with their oversight from their congressional committees to take care of their worlds. But as we were talking about, it's going to spill over into all of the commercial world, and that will get some different players involved.
It seems like there's no escape. It seems like we're bound to be compliant or not.
It's just the way the world is going to be, because too much of our economic activity, too much of our national security assets are accessible through computer systems. And so we've got to find a way to lock those down and make sure that people who touch them are being as smart as they can be. And then it'll trickle down the line to the people they work with, just passing along those requirements.
Mm-hmm. And Phil, I would love to always kind of end in a positive note. The sky's not falling. In your experience, are we better off now than we were like when you joined the government? In terms of, because we always feel like the government is like misusing some funds, or like they're not doing enough, and we're not. Everybody always complains about. If you go on TV, anybody at any given moment, somebody's complaining about the government. But overall, when I travel overseas and I come back, this is a great country, great place to live, great place to raise your kids. The infrastructure is great. I mean, if you compare us to other places around the world, we have freedom here. A lot of things that are great here. Yet, people always complain. Like it doesn't matter when, but we're better off, I think, and you can back me up on this, than we were 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. I think that's true, and it's never. Well, I'll say this: wherever technology impacts the situation, there's always both sides of the sword. There's the positive, and there's always some negative. So we've had a lot of positives in social media. You can reconnect with old classmates and friends and family and everything else, but well chronicled some of the downside stuff around social media. So there's always a give and take. But I do think when it comes to government itself and waste, fraud, and abuse, that has always been so written about and a problem. I think that's one place where IT systems are already helping and only going to help more, whether that's machine learning or whatever. I mean, I think a lot of Americans are getting notices from the IRS about small things in their returns that don't add up, not because a person reviewed that, but because a computer reviewed that and did the math faster than any person could. So I think we're going to be able to root out a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse with more intelligent systems. I think that's a really good thing. But there's kind of like no going back on a lot of this. It's a matter of applying the technology where it can do the most good, and then giving some deeper thought about how we manage some of the downsides that come with that. And those downsides, there's a couple of good books that I consumed early in my years at Commerce on that. That really paint that picture that every single technological advance, from the stirrup, which arguably was one of the most important in history, on to the present day, have always had pros and cons that come with those. So you've got to do a better job of thinking through those. But I am kind of bullish about what it would mean in the waste, fraud, and abuse area in particular, because I think we're going to be able to root out a lot more of that with smart systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's more transparency. It's easier to reach out to people. Citizens have the ability to review a lot of the information that's available to buy. That's never used to be the case.
Everybody's had to stop it and enter their zip code when they're using a credit card somewhere far from home, because the system recognizes that this card doesn't belong here. You got to prove who you are. So that's just a very simple day-to-day thing that Americans and people all around the world have experienced. But that kind of smart, systematic stuff, I think, is going to really help root out some of the waste that goes on in government.
Fantastic, Phil. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation today. It's I'm glad we managed to peel the onion a couple of things, and it's a really incredible experience.
Just call me Forrest Gump.
So cool. What's the easiest way for people to reach out to you for advice, for more insight, maybe some consulting services, whatever else
Sure.
What's the easiest way?
Easiest way is that just through our Potomac International Partners email service. I'm P Bond, real simple, and we require people to spell all that out. Potomac International Consultants Partners, PotomacInternationalPartners.com. But yeah, fill my inbox up, and happy to answer questions, but also happy to help people figure out how to really interact with government, either to sell to government or to figure out ways to adhere to regulations or even shape regulations.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Phil, for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Looking forward to maybe hosting you sometime in the future in New York.
Let's do it. All right. Thanks, David.
Okay. Thank you again.